The glass-walled boardroom of Whitmore Enterprises shimmered in the afternoon light, with the Manhattan skyline rising beyond the windows. Catherine Hayes, 28 with a journalism degree and dreams larger than her modest income, sat frozen at the table staring at the contract in front of her, her fingers trembling against the polished mahogany. Her voice came out strained as she whispered that this could not be legal, that they could not expect her to do this. Across the table, her father Charles tugged at his tie while her mother Eleanor avoided her gaze, pretending to study her nails. The family attorney leaned forward and spoke firmly, explaining that Whitmore Enterprises would erase every dollar of Hayes Media's debt, keep the employees, and preserve the family name on the magazine's masthead. In return, Catherine was to marry Alexander Whitmore and give him a child before their wedding. Catherine pushed her chair back with fury, declaring this was not the 19th century and that marriages were not made for business deals anymore. Her mother's voice finally broke the silence as she pleaded that 300 people would lose their jobs and her father's health could not endure another failure. Catherine's eyes fell on him, and she saw his pale skin and the way his hand hovered over his chest, a reminder of the heart attack that had shaken them only last year. Hayes Media had been crumbling for years, helpless against the digital revolution, and now every livelihood in the company was tied to her decision. Her voice sharpened as she demanded to know what Alexander Whitmore gained from this arrangement, other than a wife he never chose and a child he did not want. At that very moment, the boardroom doors opened and the air shifted. Alexander Whitmore entered with commanding presence, tall, broad-shouldered, dressed in a perfectly tailored charcoal suit, exuding the confidence of a man who had never doubted himself. His deep voice filled the room as he stated that what he gained was legitimacy, something money could never buy. Catherine's breath caught against her will. At 35, Alexander was the nation's most elusive bachelor, a self-made billionaire, a visionary in technology, and a philanthropist on paper. Though rumors of ruthless ambition and a frozen heart followed him everywhere, he approached her, stopping close enough for his cologne to surround her, and explained with unnerving calm that his foundation's board demanded he project the image of a family man. Her family needed saving, and he needed an instant family. It was, in his words, a simple transaction. Catherine laughed bitterly and told him having a child was not a transaction. His steel blue eyes studied her coolly as he replied that everything in life was a transaction and that journalists should understand that better than most. He leaned closer, lifting the contract, his arm brushing against hers and sending an unwanted shiver through her. He explained the prenuptial agreement in practical detail. Her family's debts cleared, a generous allowance, and full custody of the child if she ever walked away after the 5-year term. Her throat tightened as she asked about the pregnancy clause. Something flickered in his eyes before he admitted that the board found a child born before marriage too scandalous, but a pregnant bride suggested passion and romance, a love story the press could sell. Catherine scoffed, pointing out the absurdity of walking down the aisle sick and pretending to be in love. The corner of Alexander's mouth curved faintly, as he admitted he had been called insane many times, usually right before people accepted his offer. With smooth precision, he slid the contract toward her and gave her 24 hours to decide, reminding her he did not waste time. Before leaving, he promised that neither she nor the child would ever want for anything. The heavy door closed behind him, and silence returned. Catherine looked at her parents, their fear carved into their expressions, the weight of years of struggle pressing down on her shoulders, the livelihoods of hundreds resting on her choice. She whispered that she could not believe they had agreed to this. Her mother reached across and clasped her hand, reminding her that life rarely offered the perfect choice, only the least impossible one. Catherine stared at the signature line, her chest tightening with every thought of the workers who relied on her. The weakness in her father's heart, the ruin that loomed over their family. She uncapped the pen, her voice firm as she declared that if she did this, it would be on her terms and she would never be his puppet. As her signature curved across the paper, a certainty struck her that somewhere in his office Alexander Whitmore was already celebrating, but he had no idea that she had no intention of living by his rules. 2 weeks later, Catherine Hayes stood In the marble foyer of Alexander Whitmore's penthouse, her small overnight bag clutched tightly in her hand like a shield. The doorman had escorted her up through a private elevator that required a fingerprint scan, a reminder that she was stepping into a world so far from her own that even the air felt more rarefied. The housekeeper, Mrs. Reynolds, guided her through the expansive space, her voice polite and efficient as she explained that Mr. Whitmore would return at 8 o'clock sharp and expected Catherine to join him for dinner. The guest suite she was shown to was larger than her entire apartment, designed in muted tones of ivory and slate, with a bed that looked like it belonged in a luxury hotel. When she was finally alone, Catherine wandered the penthouse with cautious steps. The entire top floor belonged to Alexander, its walls of glass opening onto a panoramic view of the city. The decor was flawless in shades of gray and black, beautiful but cold, like a museum that invited admiration but forbade touch. It was striking how much it reminded her of the man himself. At precisely 8, the elevator chimed, and Alexander entered, removing his jacket with the composed ease of someone who belonged to this world absolutely. Catherine, seated on a sleek sofa with a business magazine in her lap that bore his face on the cover, quickly rose to her feet. His eyes swept over her simple black dress with a flicker of approval. "You're punctual," he observed. "I appreciate that." She lifted, her chin meeting his gaze coolly. "One of us should be. The contract said we would meet 3 days ago." He set aside his briefcase, unmoved. "A matter in Singapore required my attention. I do not apologize for prioritizing a billion-dollar deal." Catherine folded her arms. "Of course not. What is a binding contract compared to another fortune? For your empire?" He led her into the dining room where the table was already set for two. To her surprise, he pulled out her chair with a touch of courtesy she had not expected from a man who viewed their relationship as business. He reached for the decanter. "Wine?" She met his gaze sharply. "I thought the entire point was for me to get pregnant. Shouldn't I avoid alcohol?" He paused, then set the glass aside. "You're right. I hadn't considered that." They ate in silence until he finally spoke. "I arranged for a doctor's appointment tomorrow. We will confirm your health before proceeding." Catherine's spoon clattered against the bowl as she set it down. "Do you even hear yourself? You make it sound like a corporate merger, isn't it?" His expression did not waver. "We both agreed to this arrangement with clear expectations." She leaned forward, her voice fierce. "Clear for you, maybe. Let me make mine clear. I will not be treated like some broodmare. I may have agreed to this madness to save my family, but I will be treated with respect." Something flickered in his eyes, a shadow of surprise. "I never intended to disrespect you." She stood abruptly, tossing her napkin onto the table. "And yet here we are discussing my medical clearance before you decide I'm fit enough for you. I did not sign this contract to be dehumanized." He rose too, his tall frame imposing even from across the table. "What do you want then, Catherine? Romance, flowers, candlelight before I fulfill my part of the agreement?" She met his gaze head on. "I want you to see me as a person, not a clause in a contract, not a means to an end." For the first time, Alexander seemed at a loss. He studied her as though she were speaking a language foreign to him. "Perhaps," he admitted slowly, "we should take time to know each other before we proceed." A laugh escaped her despite herself. "You really do sound like a terms of service agreement." The faintest smile tugged at his mouth. "My last performance review said something similar." The unexpected humor broke the tension, and for a moment they simply stood there, something shifting between them. "Let's start over," Catherine offered, extending her hand across the table. "I'm Catherine Hayes. I love classic films. I hate olives, and apparently I'm crazy enough to agree to have a baby with a stranger." He hesitated before reaching out, his palm warm, his touch unexpectedly calloused. "Alexander Whitmore. I work too much, sleep too little, and according to my sister, I have the emotional depth of a filing cabinet." She laughed, genuinely, this time, and for the first time since their bargain began, his smile reached his eyes. They settled back into their seats, the atmosphere lighter. He listened as she spoke about journalism, asking questions that revealed more curiosity than she had expected. After dinner, they moved onto the balcony for dessert. The night breeze, cool against her skin, the city glittering far below. She praised the chocolate cake, and he admitted it was his mother's recipe, the only one he had insisted the housekeeper learn to make exactly as she had. His expression softened as he spoke of her, only to harden again as he revealed that his father had walked out after her death, leaving him to raise his younger sister alone. Catherine's heart twisted at the quiet way he recounted it. She told him she understood complicated family expectations, and for a long moment they stood in silence, their lives as different as possible yet strangely parallel. Finally, he broke the quiet, his voice dipping lower. "We should discuss logistics. The contract requires pregnancy before marriage, but the timeline is open." The fragile warmth she had begun to feel snapped. "Ever the romantic," she said bitterly. He didn't flinch. "I never claimed to be romantic." She set down her plate. "Then let's be practical. A doctor's appointment is fine, but I will not schedule intimacy like a business meeting." His gaze locked on hers, his voice dropping. "Then how do you suggest we proceed?" Something in his tone made her pulse stumble, a heat that had nothing to do with the night breeze. She stepped toward the doorway, refusing to let him see the effect he had on her. "I suggest you learn to be less calculated." He followed, his eyes never leaving hers. "My entire life has been built on calculation." She stopped and turned, her voice sharp. "And how is that working out for your personal life? From what I've heard, there's a reason you needed this arrangement at all." A dangerous spark lit in his eyes as he closed the distance between them. "And you believe you figured me out in one night?" She stood her ground. "I think you're terrified of letting anyone close enough to see who you are behind the facade." He halted just inches away, the heat of his body surrounding her. "And you're not afraid of anything?" His voice was low, daring. Catherine swallowed hard, her defiance steady even as her heart raced. "I'm afraid of plenty. But right now I'm more afraid of spending the next 5 years with a man who only sees me as a contract." His voice softened unexpectedly. "I see you, Catherine. More clearly than you think." The air between them crackled, her breath catching as his gaze lingered on her lips. She knew she should step back, but instead, she leaned toward him, her whisper carrying a dangerous challenge. "Prove it." For a moment he stood frozen, his jaw tightening, his struggle clear. Then his hand slid to the back of her neck and his lips crashed against hers. The kiss was nothing like Catherine had expected, and she had expected it in her weakest moments, though she would never admit it. She thought it would be cold, calculated, controlled, but instead it was fire, hunger, and the kind of raw passion that came from holding back too long. Alexander's lips moved against hers with force that stole her breath, his hand at her neck firm yet careful, his other arm sliding around her waist and pulling her against him as though he had no intention of letting go. Her hands rose to his chest, intending to push him away, to remind him that this was dangerous and that she had promised herself she would not become a puppet in his scheme. But instead her fingers gripped the fabric of his shirt, clutching him closer, her body betraying her with its response. She felt his chest rise against her, steady and strong, the rhythm of his heartbeat quickening under her touch. He deepened the kiss, lifting her slightly off the ground with ease, as if the weight of the world no longer mattered. Catherine's breath came in sharp gasps when they finally broke apart, her head spinning, her lips tingling, her pulse racing in a way she could not deny. She looked up at him, startled by the intensity in his eyes, a vulnerability hidden beneath, the steel blue that she had never seen before. "That," he began, his voice low and unsteady, "was not in the contract." Her lips curved into the faintest smile as she whispered back, "No, it wasn't." Yet even as she said it, she found herself rising on her toes again, her mouth brushing his with reckless need. This time, neither of them hesitated. The kiss grew fiercer, a collision of willpower and desire that neither could restrain. Alexander lifted her effortlessly into his arms, carrying her down the hallway with sure strides, his lips never leaving hers. Catherine's breath hitched as the world blurred around her, the only reality the press of his body and the taste of his mouth. He kicked open the door to his bedroom, a space just as immaculate and grand as the rest of the penthouse, but at that moment she barely saw it. When he laid her against the cool sheets, he hovered over her with a look that sent heat rushing through her veins. For once there was no calculation in his expression, no hint of the businessman who measured everything in risk and reward. Instead, his eyes held only desire, raw and unguarded. Catherine reached up, her fingers tracing the sharp line of his jaw, and for the first time she wondered what it would mean to be wanted by him, not as a contractual obligation but as a woman. His mouth found hers again, urgent and consuming, and she surrendered to the storm that had been building since their first meeting in the boardroom. Every touch was fire, every kiss a promise of something neither of them fully understood, something that broke every rule they had tried to live by. The walls of the penthouse seemed to fade away, the city beyond forgotten, the contract irrelevant. All that remained was the heat between them, the clash of pride and passion, the dangerous truth that whatever this was, it was no longer business. Hours later, when silence finally settled over the room and the first hints of dawn pressed against the glass walls, Catherine lay awake beside Alexander, her body still trembling from the force of what they had shared. His arm was draped over her waist, his breathing deep and steady, as if sleep had finally claimed him. She turned her head slightly, studying his face in the dim light. For the first time since she had signed the contract, he did not look like the untouchable billionaire who owned half the city. He looked human, almost peaceful, and that realization unsettled her more than anything. She whispered to herself, too softly for him to hear, "What have I gotten myself into?" 6 weeks passed in a blur, a whirlwind Catherine could barely keep pace with. What had begun as a contract-bound arrangement had shifted into nights of fire and mornings of distance, Alexander alternating between fierce passion and cold retreat, as though he battled himself every time he looked at her. She tried to build walls to remind herself this was not love but necessity. Yet each stolen glance, each rare smile from him, made it harder to remember where the contract ended and where something real might be beginning. One morning, standing, barefoot in the gleaming bathroom of the penthouse, Catherine clutched the small plastic stick in her trembling hands. 2 pink lines glared back at her, undeniable and absolute. Tears blurred her vision as she whispered to her reflection that this was not how she had ever imagined starting a family. She had dreamed of building a career first, of falling in love with someone who chose her freely, of welcoming a child into a home full of warmth instead of obligation. Yet here she was, pregnant by a man who had practically purchased the right to father her child. A gentle knock startled her. "Catherine?" Alexander's voice drifted through the door, unusually tentative. "Are you all right? You've been in there a long time." She swallowed hard, wiping her eyes before opening the door. He stood in his impeccable suit, polished and commanding, but when he saw her face, his expression softened into something closer to concern. "What happened?" His hand twitched as if he wanted to touch her, but he hesitated, unsure if he had that right. Without a word, Catherine held out the test. He stared at it for a long moment, his features unreadable until finally his voice broke the silence. "You're pregnant." His tone was neutral, measured, as though confirming the figures of a financial report. She forced a bitter smile. "That was the plan, wasn't it? Congratulations, Mr. Whitmore, your transaction is proceeding right on schedule." He flinched at her words, a barely perceptible crack in his controlled mask. "I thought things had changed between us." Her heart ached as she brushed past him, her voice sharp. "Have they? Because from where I stand, I'm still just a contract you signed." His jaw tightened as he followed her into the bedroom, frustration radiating from him. "That's not fair. The last 6 weeks have been confusing, exhilarating, terrifying, and exhausting." She cut him off, spinning around to face him. "One moment you look at me like I'm the answer, to a question you're afraid to ask, and the next you're back to being the cold businessman who sees me as nothing more than a clause to fulfill. He ran a hand through his perfect hair, a rare sign of disarray. This isn't easy for me, Catherine. And you think it's easy for me? She demanded, pointing at the test still clenched in his hand. I'm the one whose body will change completely. I'm the one who will walk down the aisle visibly pregnant with the world watching. I'm the one who will give birth to a child conceived because of a business deal. Tell me again who has it easy. For a long moment, silence pressed between them, his expression shifting through emotions she could not read. Finally, he placed the test gently on the dresser and stepped closer, his voice quieter than she had ever heard it. You're right. I've been inconsistent. This isn't what either of us planned for our lives, and I haven't handled it well. Her breath caught. In all the time she had known him, Alexander Whitmore had never once admitted fault. I don't know how to do this, he continued, his eyes flickering with something raw. I don't know how to be a husband or a father. My own examples were lacking. Her voice softened despite herself. And you think I know how to be a wife chosen for breeding purposes? The ghost of a smile touched his lips. When you put it that way, we sound like characters in a dystopian novel. She laughed against her will, the tension loosening slightly. Maybe we are. Two people trying to navigate the impossible. He took another step, close enough now that she could smell the subtle cologne clinging to him. For what it's worth, if I had to be in this impossible situation with someone, I'm glad it's you. The sincerity in his eyes made her chest ache in ways she did not want to admit. She opened her mouth to respond, but the shrill ring of his phone cut through the fragile moment. He glanced at the caller ID, his face hardening. The board meeting, he muttered. I have to take this. Go, she said quietly, stepping back. We'll talk later. He hesitated, torn between his world of power and the woman standing in front of him, with his child growing inside her. Dinner tonight, he promised. I'll come home early. She nodded, though disappointment pressed heavy in her chest. When the door closed behind him, Catherine sank onto the edge of the bed, her hand drifting to her still flat stomach. She whispered to the life within her, uncertain whether it was a comfort or a curse. You and I are in this together now. Let's hope your father figures it out before it's too late. 3 months later, Catherine Hayes stood in the bridal suite of Whitmore Tower's rooftop garden, her reflection staring back from a full-length mirror. The gown had been custom designed to soften the curve of her 4-month pregnant belly, lace and silk draping strategically to turn her condition into something ethereal, almost regal. Her mother adjusted the veil with trembling hands, whispering that she looked like something out of a fairy tale. Catherine smiled faintly, though it never reached her eyes. A fairy tale where the princess is already expecting, she muttered, softly. The past months had been a blur of fittings, stage photographs, and carefully orchestrated public appearances. Whitmore's PR team worked tirelessly to transform their arrangement into a whirlwind romance that dazzled society. Candid shots of them strolling through Central Park, glamorous appearances at charity events, carefully worded interviews that painted their relationship as fate. The story was so polished that sometimes Catherine almost believed it herself, especially on nights when Alexander came home not out of obligation, but with genuine desire to spend time with her. Those were the moments that shook her most, when the lines blurred and she could not tell where performance ended and truth began. A knock sounded at the door, and her father entered in a sharp tuxedo that could not disguise how much the recent months had aged him. His voice was heavy with emotion as he told her it was time. She pressed his arm gently and whispered that she was as ready as she would ever be to marry a man she still wasn't sure truly wanted her. The rooftop garden glittered with white flowers and crystal arches designed to mimic frozen waterfalls. 200 guests filled the chairs, most of them Alexander's business partners and political connections, all dressed in their finest, their eyes trained on her as she stepped onto the aisle. She walked slowly, the winter sky above her clear, the December air cool against her cheeks, every step accompanied by the silent weight of expectation. At the altar, Alexander stood waiting in a custom tuxedo that fit him as though it had been cut by fate itself. His face was composed, but when his eyes met hers, the mask slipped for just an instant, his gaze filled with awe that made her heart skip. For one brief moment, she let herself believe he might see her as more than a deal. The illusion shattered as murmurs rippled through the crowd. A woman in the third row held up a tablet, showing images to her companion while whispering urgently. By the time Catherine reached Alexander's side, the whispers had grown louder. He leaned slightly toward her, his lips brushing her ear. "Something's wrong." Before she could answer, a voice rose from the crowd. "Mr. Whitmore, Miss Hayes, would you care to comment on these photos?" A woman with a press badge stood, holding her phone high. "They show Miss Hayes leaving Dr. Whitman's fertility clinic 3 months before your supposed relationship began." The garden fell into stunned silence. Catherine's blood drained from her face as cameras flashed and more voices joined. Another reporter stood, raising his voice above the chaos. "Or perhaps you'd like to explain why Hayes Media's debts were wiped out the very next day." Her father stepped forward, his face red with anger, shouting that it was outrageous, but the damage was done. Reporters stood in waves, hurling accusations of a fabricated marriage, a scandal manufactured for profit, a love story bought and paid for. Cameras exploded with light as guests shifted uneasily in their seats. Alexander's jaw clenched as his hand closed around Catherine's, strong and steady, grounding her against the storm. He bent close, his voice low and intense, cutting through, the noise only for her. "Do you trust me?" She met his eyes, and for the first time since their arrangement began, she did not see the calculating billionaire or the cold strategist. She saw the man who brought her ginger tea when her morning sickness left her pale, the man who stayed awake through the night listening to her talk about her writing dreams, the man who sometimes looked at her like she was a puzzle he could not stop trying to solve. Slowly, she nodded. Alexander turned to the crowd, his voice rising with commanding authority that silenced the chaos. "Ladies and gentlemen, it seems our wedding has drawn some uninvited guests with interesting theories about our relationship." His gaze softened as it landed on Catherine. "The truth is, they are not entirely wrong." A gasp rippled through the audience, but Alexander did not falter. "When I first approached the Hayes family, it was indeed a business decision. But what I did not expect was Catherine." His hand tightened around hers, his eyes raw with something startlingly real. "I did not expect to meet a woman who would challenge every wall I had built. A woman who demanded more from me than I thought I was capable of giving. Yes, our marriage began as an arrangement, but somewhere between the contracts and the board meetings and the late-night conversations, I found myself falling for her." His voice carried with power, yet cracked faintly with emotion. "You can publish your stories about fertility clinics and debts cleared. But what you cannot deny is that I am standing here today not because of a contract, but because I cannot imagine a life without her." The garden fell silent, 200 people holding their breath. Catherine's throat tightened, unsure if he was performing or confessing. But when he turned back to her and whispered only for her to hear, "I meant every word. If you want to walk away, I'll honor my promises and let you go." She saw something unguarded in his eyes, something closer to hope than calculation. Her chest swelled with emotion as she turned toward the officiant. Her voice was steady, though her heart trembled. "I think we were in the middle of a wedding." Alexander's shoulders eased, relief flickering across his features before his composure returned. The ceremony continued in a surreal haze. When it came time for vows, he surprised her by setting aside the prepared speech and speaking from the heart. His words made no promise of fairy tale love, but offered honesty, respect, and the will to build something real from their unconventional beginning. When Catherine spoke in turn, she admitted the strangeness of how they had begun, but revealed her hope that what they were creating might grow into something lasting. As he kissed her at the altar, softer and more genuine than any kiss they had shared before, she realized that for the first time she did not care about the flashing cameras or the whispered suspicions. With his hand steady in hers and their child growing between them, the truth of what they were building together mattered more than any headline. The whirlwind that followed their wedding was unlike anything Catherine had imagined. The public was divided, half convinced the marriage was a sham, half enchanted by Alexander's heartfelt declaration. For weeks, every magazine and television program dissected their story, replaying the rooftop scandal and speculating on whether it had all been carefully scripted. Catherine ignored the noise, focusing on the one truth she could not escape. She was carrying Alexander Whitmore's child, and despite the cameras, the suspicions, and the shadows of doubt, the life growing inside her was real. The penthouse became their private battlefield and sanctuary. Some nights Alexander would come home late, sliding into bed beside her with a gentleness that melted her defenses, whispering questions about her cravings or the baby's movements. Other nights he retreated into silence, shutting himself away in his office, his gaze cold when she tried to reach him. Catherine learned to live with the duality, the warmth of the man who kissed her belly before meetings and the distance of the billionaire who built his empire on walls no one could breach. 6 weeks after the wedding, she stood in the bathroom with trembling hands and tears streaking her cheeks as she whispered to the mirror that this was not how she thought she would feel, caught between yearning and doubt. That morning, Alexander found her pale and shaken, the pregnancy test lying between them like proof of a battle already lost and won. When she challenged him with bitterness, he flinched. When she accused him of treating her like a transaction, he admitted what she had never expected him to say, that he did not know how to be a husband, that he had no idea how to be a father, that his examples had failed him completely. For the first time, Catherine saw him stripped of certainty, his voice low, his eyes shadowed with fear. She softened despite herself, her anger waning when she saw the truth in him. And then, unexpectedly, he said words that would linger in her mind for weeks. "If I had to be in this impossible situation with anyone, I am glad it's you." She wanted to believe him, wanted to hold on to that sincerity. But before she could answer, his phone rang, pulling him back into the world that always seemed to own him. He promised dinner, promised a conversation, promised time. She wanted to believe those promises, but as she lay down on the bed alone that night, her hand resting on her still flat stomach, she whispered to her unborn child that they would have to be strong because their father still didn't know how to let love win over fear. Over the weeks that followed, Alexander tried in his own way. He arranged her doctor's appointments, insisted on walking beside her during every checkup, and kept her away from the stress of board meetings and scandals. He was protective, attentive in practical ways, yet Catherine longed for something deeper, something uncalculated, something real. And sometimes, when his hand lingered against hers longer than necessary, when his eyes softened as he watched her sleep, she wondered if that realness was closer than either of them dared admit. It was one late evening, after she had fallen asleep, on the couch surrounded by stacks of old magazines, that she woke to find him draping a blanket over her. His movements were quiet, almost reverent, his gaze lingering on her face as if she were something fragile and irreplaceable. She closed her eyes quickly, pretending to still be asleep, but her heart thudded painfully because for the first time she believed he might truly see her, not as a contract, not as a headline, but as the woman carrying his future. 5 months after the wedding, Catherine lowered herself carefully into a chair at the kitchen table of their Hamptons estate, one hand pressed against her swollen belly. She groaned with a mix of humor and discomfort. "Your son is using my bladder as a trampoline." Alexander looked up from his tablet, the hint of a smile tugging at his lips. "Why is he always my son when he misbehaves?" She sipped the herbal tea the housekeeper had set before her, smirking. "That's the rule. The frustrating traits belong to you, the brilliant ones to me." His smile widened, his steel eyes softening in a way that still caught her off guard. In the months since their wedding, something had changed. Their days had become a careful dance between public appearances and private battles. But the man who had once spoken of her only in terms of contracts now carried her bags, attended every doctor's appointment, and fussed over her comfort more than she would have believed possible. Yet his walls still rose at times, shutting her out when she needed him most, leaving her to wonder if she was imagining the tenderness that flickered through his mask. That afternoon, the press conference at Whitmore Tower spiraled into chaos. Reporters hurled accusations about the timing of the pregnancy and whispers of board manipulation. Catherine had forced herself to smile for the cameras, but when the first contraction seized her, her face paled, her voice breaking as she whispered to Alexander that her water had broken. For a heartbeat, the composed billionaire vanished, replaced by a man gripped by panic. He rushed to her side, barking orders into his phone, gripping her hand tightly as she was wheeled out. Hours later, after waves of pain and fear, Catherine lay in a hospital bed, exhausted but trembling with awe as a nurse placed a newborn bundle in her arms. 7 pounds of fragile, perfect life with dark hair and eyes that mirrored his father's steely blue. Tears filled her eyes as she whispered, "Hello, little one. We've been waiting for you." Alexander stood rigid beside her, staring down at the baby as though the world had shifted beneath his feet. She asked gently if he wanted to hold his son, and for the first time in her memory, uncertainty clouded his face. "I don't know how," he admitted, his voice raw. She guided his hands, easing the child into his arms. His movements were careful, reverent, as though he were cradling something more valuable than all the empires he had ever built. "He's so small," he murmured. "But strong," she whispered, pointing to the tiny fist curling around his thumb. Something cracked in Alexander's face then, a softening, a surrender to feelings he had fought so hard to bury. "William," he said suddenly, "after my grandfather. William Hayes Whitmore." Catherine smiled through her tears, touched by the quiet sentiment. "It suits him." The moment was cut short when his assistant entered, speaking of urgent matters with the board, of leaked documents and looming threats. Alexander's jaw tightened as conflict raged across his face. Catherine touched his arm softly. "Go. Handle it. We'll be here when you return." He kissed her forehead, lingering just long enough to make her heart ache before he left. When he returned hours later, his tie loosened and his expression stormy, Catherine could see the weight he carried. Yet when his eyes found her holding William, something in him calmed. He admitted that the board questioned their marriage again, demanding proof that it was real, demanding public appearances and interviews, proof of love that no contract could ever provide. His voice cracked when he confessed that he no longer knew how to separate obligation from truth, because what he felt when he looked at her and their son was unlike anything he had ever known. For the first time, Alexander admitted the words she had longed to hear. "I don't know if I can call this love. I've never known what love truly is. But I do know the thought of losing you and William terrifies me more than losing everything else I've built." His confession left her breathless because in that moment, she realized his walls were breaking, and that the man who once treated her as a transaction was beginning to learn what it meant to belong to someone. The weeks following William's birth were both tender and tense. Nights were filled with restless cries, tiny fists waving in the air, and moments when Catherine thought her heart might burst from love. Alexander was different now, softer and private, sometimes standing over the crib for hours as though guarding his son from unseen threats. Yet his phone never stopped ringing, his empire pulling him away even as he tried for the first time to put family first. It was during one of those nights, when Catherine padded barefoot into the living room to find him asleep in the armchair, with William resting against his chest, that she realized the change in him was real. His hair was mussed, his tie loosened, his lips parted in rare vulnerability. She whispered softly, "You're not the man you used to be." And for once, she meant it as a blessing, but shadows lingered. At Catherine's 6-week postnatal appointment, whispers of betrayal reached her ears through hushed gossip from the staff, muttered words about Alexander's sister Isabella and his former business partner Damian Cross. They were seen together, too often, their names linked to rumors of hostile board maneuvers and quiet attempts to undermine Alexander's control. Catherine dismissed it at first as idle talk until the truth revealed itself in devastating clarity. Late one evening, She returned from soothing William only to hear raised voices in Alexander's study. She paused at the door, heart pounding, as Isabella's sharp tone cut through the air. "You've become weak, Alex. All because of her. The board sees it, Damien sees it, and soon the whole world will. You've forgotten who you are." Alexander's voice thundered back, low and dangerous. "I haven't forgotten, I've changed. And if you or Damien think you can use Catherine or my son as leverage, you'll regret it." Isabella's laugh was cold, merciless. "You think love makes you strong? It makes you blind. Father would be ashamed of you." Catherine's chest tightened, her breath shallow as the pieces fell into place. The leaks to the press, the constant scrutiny, the perfectly timed rumors at every public event, none of it had been chance. It was sabotage, orchestrated from within his own bloodline. When she pushed open the door, silence fell. Isabella turned, her eyes narrowing with disdain. "Ah, the contract wife. Do you even know what kind of man you've tied yourself to?" Catherine stepped forward, fury flashing through her. "I know exactly who he is. A man who works himself to the bone. A man who saved my family from ruin. A man who loves his son enough to fight the world for him. Whatever you think you can take from him, you'll have to go through me first." Isabella sneered, muttering that Catherine was nothing but a pawn before storming out. Alexander stood frozen, his jaw clenched, his eyes shadowed with pain. Catherine touched his arm gently, her voice steady despite the storm inside her. "She's wrong. You're not weak. You're finally becoming the man you were meant to be." His hand covered hers, the tension in his body trembling under her touch. "I don't know how to fight this, Catherine. Damien holds secrets, Isabella knows where to strike, and the board is restless. I can handle attacks from the outside. I've done it all my life. But this, my own sister..." His voice broke, rare and raw. Catherine lifted his chin, forcing him to meet her eyes. "Then you fight differently this time. You fight not for power, not for image, but for us, for William, for what we're building together. You're not alone anymore." For the first time, Alexander let his forehead rest against hers, his breath unsteady, his mask shattered. And in that fragile silence, Catherine understood that love was no longer a possibility between them. It was already happening, whether he admitted it or not. The boardroom of Whitmore Enterprises had never felt so hostile. The long table gleamed. Under harsh lights, the faces around it carved in suspicion and disdain. Catherine sat beside Alexander, her hands folded tightly in her lap, her heart pounding as whispers of betrayal and scandal swirled in the air. The board had called an emergency meeting demanding proof of stability, proof of authenticity, proof that Alexander Whitmore was still the man capable of steering an empire. At the head of the table, Damien Cross leaned back in his chair with smug satisfaction. His voice was smooth as he presented folders filled with photographs and articles. "These," he announced, "are evidence of deception. Fertility clinic visits before the marriage. Sudden erasure of Hayes Media debts. Fabricated. Romance stage for the press. The public is questioning whether this company can be trusted under leadership built on lies." Alexander's jaw clenched, but before he could speak, Isabella chimed in with venomous precision. "Our father built this legacy on strength, not on weakness, not on staged fairy tales and inconvenient wives. You've let yourself be distracted, Alex, and the board will not suffer for your personal mistakes." Catherine's fingers dug into her palms, fury rising in her chest, but Alexander's hand closed over hers beneath the table, steady and warm, silencing her before she spoke. He rose to his feet with calm authority, his voice deep and commanding. "What you see as weakness, I see as evolution. I have built this company from the ground up. I have faced competitors twice my size and left them scrambling in my shadow. Do you truly believe a woman and child make me less capable of leading? Or do they make me more dangerous because now I have something real to fight for?" The board members shifted uncomfortably, whispers sparking at the edges of the table. Damien scoffed. "So this is your defense? That you found love in the middle of a business arrangement? The world will laugh at you. Catherine could not stay silent any longer. She rose beside Alexander, her voice steady, her eyes blazing. The world can laugh. They've already judged us, dissected us, called us frauds. But what they can never take away is the truth that we are here, together, stronger than the storm you tried to create. You talk about deception, but the only deception I see is from those who plot behind closed doors, who leak lies to the press, who betray their own family for power. Her gaze cut to Isabella, then to Damien. You accuse Alexander of weakness, but the only weakness here is envy. The room fell silent, the weight of her words sinking into the heavy air. For a moment, Catherine feared she had gone too far, but then Alexander's hand slipped into hers, his grip fierce with pride. He looked at the board with unflinching certainty. I have faced men like you my entire life, but this time I am not fighting alone, and that makes me unstoppable. The chairman, an older man with decades etched into his face, cleared his throat. The board has heard enough. A vote will be cast. Papers shuffled, hands raised, voices counted. The outcome was close, too close, the tension unbearable as the numbers were tallied. Finally, the chairman announced the result. By a margin of 1, Alexander Whitmore will remain CEO. However, the board requires continued proof of stability. Any further scandal will result in immediate removal. Relief surged through Catherine, though the threat still hung heavy in the air. Isabella stormed from the room, her heels striking the floor like gunshots, Damien following with a mask of cold fury. Alexander exhaled slowly, turning to her, his voice low and raw. You didn't have to speak for me. She met his gaze firmly. Yes, I did. Because for the first time, this isn't just your fight, it's ours. In that moment, surrounded by enemies and doubt, Alexander realized what Catherine had already known. Their marriage had started as a contract, but it had become something neither of them could deny. It had become a partnership forged not by obligation but by choice. Winter gave way to spring, and the Whitmore estate bloomed with colors Catherine had never seen before, gardens bursting with life as though the world itself mirrored the changes in her heart. The scandal had quieted. The board was temporarily silenced, and William's laughter filled the house like sunlight. Catherine found herself smiling more, not because the world had suddenly become easy, but because for the first time, she no longer carried the burden alone. One evening, she stood on the balcony with William in her arms, the baby's tiny fingers tangled in her hair as the city lights glittered far below. She whispered promises to him, telling him that he would grow up surrounded not by contracts and expectations but by love. Behind her, she heard the soft creak of the door and felt Alexander's presence before she turned. He came to stand beside her, his gaze on their son, his expression unreadable. For a long moment they stood in silence, the three of them framed by the skyline. Finally, Alexander spoke, his voice quiet but steady. When I was a boy, I promised myself I would never need anyone. Needing people meant they could hurt you. It meant they could leave. I built walls so high even I couldn't see over them. He reached out, brushing his thumb across William's cheek before meeting Catherine's eyes. And then you came, you and this little one. And for the first time I want the walls to come down. Her throat tightened as she whispered. They already have. He took William gently from her arms and cradled him with practiced ease, the billionaire who once confessed he didn't know how to hold a child now rocking his son with tenderness that melted her. His eyes returned to hers, raw with vulnerability. I love you, Catherine. I can't tell you when it started, but somewhere between the contract and the chaos, I fell in love with you. Not because you saved my reputation, not because you gave me a son, but because you made me want to be more than the man I was. Her breath caught, her chest aching with emotion. You don't have to be more. You just have to be you. He shifted William into one arm and reached for her with the other, pulling her close, his lips capturing hers in a kiss that was not fire or desperation this time, but something softer, deeper, truer. It was the kiss of a man who had finally chosen love, not strategy. When they broke apart, Catherine leaned into him, her voice steady with certainty. We may not have started the right way, but this is real now. You, me, William. This is our family. Alexander's arms tightened around her and their son, his eyes shining with conviction. No contracts, no bargains, just us. And as the Ide night wrapped around them, the city lights flickering like 1,000 witnesses to their truth, Catherine knew that the story of her life had changed forever. She had been forced into a marriage that was never supposed to be love, yet somewhere, along the way, love had found them anyway.